All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today for our session on valuing natural capital with economics, dollars, cents and nonsense. I'll start out today. My name's Jeremy Cheeseman. I'm from Mars & Jacob Associates, based out of Melbourne. Start out today by recognising that I'm speaking today from Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation, and also acknowledging that it's International Women's Day. So, both important place-based things. What we're talking about today is issues around valuing natural capital with economics. This is the first of our series of Mars & Jacob Talks Live. And look, what we're really trying to do with these Mars & Jacob Talks Live sessions is really to encourage, frank and fearless open discussion around things that we do in our work and around things that we really think matter. And so what we're looking to do with this series is to pitch ideas to you, have active discussion, and get your feedback on what your thoughts are and how we can progress on some of these policy issues. This is our first ever Mars & Jacobs Talks Live. So, we thank you first for joining, but also if you've got ideas about how we can make them better, and in particular, if you've got ideas and issues that you'd like us to explore through the Mars & Jacob Talks Live series, then we'd really love to hear from you. A couple of slides in between now and the discussion that we're going to have at the end. So first of all, I'll cover off kind of why am I here? Why do I have, for example, authority to speak about this? Why does this conversation matter? And then we'll move into some quick slides on what is natural capital economic valuation. We'll do a quick slide on valuation methods, and then we'll focus in on the things that I'm hoping that we can really focus in on this discussion, because it's where the real substance and the real issues lie that are interesting. And that's when you're commissioning or when you're doing natural capital valuation work or reviewing natural capital valuation work of others. What are the sorts of things that you want to be looking out for to get comfort, that the work that you're looking at is robust and defensible, and then it can be used in a robust and defensible way to inform decisions about things like investments, policies, and the distribution of benefits and costs across society. So really, that's we want to take you in some detail through that. And then we also want to give you some ideas about things that you should basically be asking your economic advisor. And again, those questions are really structured around looking to help people ask questions so that you can understand and get comfort around the work that's being, that you're reviewing, or the work that's being done for you. So as I said, 30 minutes. There is quite a bit to cover, so I'll move pretty quickly. I'll start out by saying, why am I here? So first of all, just a very, very brief background in me. I did my PhD in environmental and resource economics quite a while ago, but one of the things that I focused on during that PhD was essentially methods for valuing natural capital. And so over the past 20 years or so, I've done tens of studies, but also have tens of journal papers, peer-reviewed journal papers and other papers that have been released showing applications of a lot of the methods that we're going to be talking about here today. And I've done that across, working with institutions, with academics, and also at the local, state and Commonwealth government level. And it's probably also fair to say, for those who know me already and who are on the call, that I'm a bit of a natural capital valuation fanatic. I'm one of those people who reads natural capital valuation journal papers whilst on vacation, much to the chagrin of the rest of my family. So that's a little bit about me, but I think it's also important just to understand, as we're going into this discussion, the background that people are bringing and the level of experience that people bring to this work. So why does this conversation matter? I think, for us, for all of these Talks Live sessions, we really, this is one of the driving questions that we're asking as we're coming in and doing these. We don't want to just be doing presentations where we talk at you. We want to be doing presentations where, there's an issue of substance that we want to be having a conversation with you about. And so the reason that we think it's timely to be having this sort of discussion now is because natural capital valuation is really growing in terms of popularity. As I said, I've been doing this for 20 years and it's only really been becoming more widely used and more widely accepted over the past 10 years or so. So really the discipline is growing, people's understanding of it, of natural capital valuation is growing, and natural capital valuation is being used in a whole range of different ways. So it's being used to inform investment decisions, it's being used to set up sustainable financing and funding, it's being used for pricing of things like offsets and a whole range of other applications. And so these are a lot of really important decisions that relate to people's well-being and society. And so to be good advice, natural capital valuations need to be robust and defensible. And we think that it's really important that people who are consuming natural capital valuation work understand what's going on underneath the hood, so that it's not a black box for you, and so that you can have confidence in the numbers that you're putting forward in your business cases, in your investment proposals, in your valuations of natural capital assets. And one of the main reasons for that is that if we don't give you that confidence, or if there's nothing there's something underneath the hood that's going wrong, then essentially natural capital valuation could have its legs cut out from underneath it. And so we don't want that to happen. It's an important contribution to understanding the value of natural capital and embedding natural capital in investment decisions and policy decisions. And so, as I said, one of the things that we want to be doing here is giving you confidence to understand what's underneath the hood and to ask questions so that you have a level of comfort in the natural capital valuation work. Okay, so really quickly, this sort of slide could take a couple of lectures at uni to go through, but what is natural capital valuation? The best way to think about natural capital or natural capital economic valuation, probably by way of introduction, a couple of points. First, economic valuation of natural capital or economic valuation of the environment is just one of many ways that we can value the environment. And so there's a broader question of whether we can use economics at all to value the environment. For us as a discipline, we would say that the answer is clearly yes. There are questions around how well you can do those applications in certain situations, and maybe that's something that we can discuss later. But there are other forms of doing valuation. So other forms of valuation would, for example, include environmental economic accounting valuations. And so that is different from economic valuation in ways that we can discuss later on. And there are also other non-monetary ways of valuing and assigning value to the environment and natural capital. So the main point here is that what we're talking about today is natural capital valuation using economic techniques. And that's one tool in your toolkit. And when you're doing valuation work, you'll often use complementary methods so that you can start to triangulate different types of values, but also so you can understand other people's value perspectives and how they look at value, recognizing that not everybody looks at value through the lens of economics. So in a nutshell, this is one slide when we think about natural capital valuation, how we go about it. So in very, very simple terms, the economic value of something is how much an individual or somebody is willing to pay for that good or service. Now, it's probably easiest to give an example of that. And so one of the examples that I like to give, especially when I'm talking to people first thing in the morning, is the economic value of a cup of coffee. The economic value of a cup of coffee is my willingness to pay for it. So when you think about a cup of coffee, you'll go into a cafe and you'll pay for the cup of coffee, let's say $4. Now that $4 includes, the coffee beans, how much you pay the barista, what you pay in business profits to the business, for example, and some profit that goes back to the business. But what I pay, the $4 that I pay, is not the same as the economic value of the cup of coffee for me. And what I mean by that is that if you told me, for example, that I was only allowed to have one cup of coffee for the day, I wasn't allowed to have any caffeine substitutes for the rest of the day, or energy drinks or whatever else, then my willingness to pay for that cup of coffee is going to be higher than $4. I'm a bit of a coffee addict, so maybe I'm willing to pay $6 or $7 for that cup of coffee. And further, if you tell me that it's made by it's my favorite type of coffee and it's made by a barista that, I know makes really good coffee. Maybe I'm even willing to pay a little bit more than that. So the economic value of a cup of coffee to me is the amount of money that I'm willing to have, the maximum amount of money that I'm willing to hand over the counter to pay for that cup of coffee. And my willingness to pay might be greater than the $4 that I pay for that cup of coffee. So this is basically the principle of economic valuation. The underlying principle of economic valuation, whether it be of a cup of coffee or whether it be of for things like shade from tree canopies to reduce sun and achieve microclimate regulation, or improved amenity in the public open space. All of that can, in principle, be measured using people's willingness to pay. Now, the difference between willingness to pay for a cup of coffee and willingness to pay for habitat for wildlife is that, we buy millions of cups of coffee a day. And there's quite there's a market for it. So you can observe the prices that are being paid. You can look at the differences in quality of coffee. And so there is a market essentially for buying and selling, lattes and cappuccinos first thing in the morning. On the other hand, there isn't a market for things like habitat for wildlife or amenity and landscape aesthetics. And so the question becomes, in the absence of these market-based approaches, like being able to see a cup of coffee, how do we go about valuing these things? And this slide is just it's a slide from a piece of work, a lot of work that we've done previously. And all of the things on this page are things that we've valued previously as part of natural capital economic valuation. So, the economic value of trees and the shade that they provide, greenhouse gas mitigation, air pollution amelioration, habitat for wildlife, a connection to nature. All of these things we can use economics to assign values to. All right, one quick slide on valuation methods. Usually most presentations on valuing natural capital really focus in on the different types of methods that you can use. I'm happy to come back to that, this discussion later on when we get into the Q&A. But really at this point, we're only going to do one slide because I think it's actually more interesting and maybe more instructive in our discussions to talk about the things that you should be looking out for with different methods rather than talking about the methods themselves. And so there are a couple of different ways that we can estimate the economic value of natural capital. So one of them is directly through markets. And so, a good example of a natural capital market, for example, might be a carbon market. So you can measure the value of the economic value of capital of carbon in an efficient market by looking at how much people are willing to pay for, a unit of carbon abatement. So that is a market-based approach. Another way that we can estimate natural capital economic values is by looking at what people, the behaviour of people. And so, a really nice example and a simple example is thinking, for example, around what is the economic value of having nice amenity outside your house. So the way that you can, for example, the way that you can estimate the economic value of, say, living beside a wetland or living beside parkland or forestry is you can take large data sets of properties and you compare all of their characteristics. So, number of bedrooms, when it was being built, how big the land size is, and a whole range of other factors. And then you also include whether, for example, the house is next to a wetland or whether the house is next to a park. And with a bit of fancy math in the background, you can essentially come out with an estimate of the price premium. So how much more people are willing to pay for a 4-bedroom house on 300 square meters in a certain suburb if it is next to a park or a wetland versus a property that's not next to a park and a wetland. And so that additional price premium that people are willing to pay is a part estimate of the economic value of the park or the wetland to the people owning the house. And that's reflected in the fact that they've been willing to pay a price premium to have access to that natural capital resource. So in that sort of situation, we're not measuring that transaction directly through the market, but we're inferring, or we're parceling out the additional premium that people are willing to pay from the house price itself. So we're imputing that value through their observed behaviour. Another approach that people use to understand what people are willing to pay for things is simply through asking people in surveys. And so this is something you'll see if you have a look at my bio that I've done several journal papers on. There are different types of approaches for understanding what people are willing to pay, but in its most simple sense, you ask people in a survey, how much are you willing to pay for an additional, let's say, an additional 100 hectares of wetland that will provide habitat services for birds, fish, breeding grounds, greenhouse gas amelioration, and a range of other things. And so it becomes a very simple, are you willing to pay this type question? There are more sophisticated ways of doing it, but at its core, when we ask people through surveys and asking them to state their preferences, we're really going back to that fundamental question of how much are you willing to pay to get a environmental change, an environmental improvement, or some form of natural capital supplied to you. And again, we can talk through those methods later on if we want to. The fourth way that I point out that people are using to value things is through this process called value transfer. And so that very messy sort of slide that we've got there below, I actually lifted off the website, and sorry, I haven't attributed it, but I'm happy to share it. Share the link so that people can see where it came from. But essentially, what we're doing in value transfer is we're not doing original survey work. So we're not going out and asking people directly. We're not observing transactions through markets. We're not imputing values by looking, at large data sets of real estate values. What we're doing is we're looking at a study that's already been done. So on the left-hand side, somebody's done a study looking at the value of parkland with a beach and some forest and nice blue water. Somebody's already done that study, and we're taking that value from that study and we're transferring that value across to the policy side. So this is probably value transfer is if you've seen people doing benefit cost analysis of, let's say, environmental natural resource decisions, value transfer is pretty much the predominant method that we're seeing people use in a lot of, well, in most applications in Australia at the moment. So taking numbers from an original study and applying it to another location. Now, that makes sense if we're budget and time limited. Value transfer is a very pretty straightforward approach. But there are a hell of a lot of things that can go wrong when you're doing value transfer that you need to be aware of. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about in a while is the sort of things that you need to be looking out for when your advisors or when you're doing a value transfer technique. And there are a couple of good pieces of guidance out in the public domain on how to do good value transfer. One of them was done by the Productivity Commission a couple of years ago. Another one's done by the Victorian Department, Digita, and we can provide you with those links later on, and they give really good guidance on the sort of trips and traps that you need to be thinking about when you're looking at value transfer. All right. Let's spend 10 minutes now on things to look out for. And so this is really the sort of thing that we really want to focus in on this discussion. And really what we're doing in these next couple of slides is we're giving very, very light treatment to a whole range of subjects, and really doing that to hopefully open up discussion and stimulate discussion in the last half an hour. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of speed through some of these topics. And then if you want to come back, please just ask questions and let's include it in the discussion. And then we'll come back and explore these things in more detail. So really in the last 30 minutes, we really want to be just guided by you around the things that you want to talk about and the questions that you want to raise. So the first thing that we'd say in terms of trips and traps to look out for when you're looking at work that is natural capital economic valuation work is the first thing that you want to keep in your mind when you're looking at numbers economic value numbers is that the numbers should be commensurate. And so what we mean by that is that if we are comparing, for example, the economic value of or how a property price increases as a result of being next to a park versus how urban parks contribute to urban cooling, and that then transfers into avoided health costs, we want to be comparing apples with apples in terms of the values. And there are a couple of things that you need to look out for when you're doing this. So one of them is whether the natural capital valuation is called a stock or a flow value. The easiest way to think about stock and flow values is a stock value is essentially an asset value, whereas a flow value is a service value. So for example, the stock value of a stock value, for example, is a house. So the property premium that you're paying for the house as a result of being next to a park is a one-off value that you pay once. It doesn't occur every year. Whereas another type of value, say the avoided costs of heat amelioration, urban heat amelioration, is a flow value, because each year as trees grow, we will have different impacts as a result of the flow of services, the urban cooling services that the trees are providing. And so when we're doing valuations, we want to make sure that we're comparing a flow value with a flow value or a stock value with a stock value. We shouldn't be comparing flow values and stock values. And we see a lot of work done by others, economic advisors, who do this sort of value transfer where they're comparing stock and flow values. And so the first point is that we shouldn't be doing that. The second thing that we also want to understand when we're looking at economic values is whether these natural capital values are total, average, or marginal values. Now, a total value is the total economic value of a good or a service. So, think about, let's go back to cups of coffee. So, the total value of two cups of coffee is $4 plus $4. The average value of 2 cups of coffee is $4 plus $4 equals $4 on average per cup of coffee. A marginal value is the value of an additional unit of a good or service. And so, for example, if we're thinking about going back to that coffee example, I might be willing to pay $7 for my first coffee. After I've had my first coffee, I might only be willing to pay $5 for my second coffee. And by the time I get to the 10th coffee of the day, I've had too much coffee. So I might only be willing to pay $1, or I might say, I'm not willing to pay for that cup of coffee at all. So that's an example of a marginal value. We often see, again, people using in economic analysis, mixing total, average, and marginal values. And again, we can talk about it later, but you want to try and avoid that as much as possible. When you're comparing natural capital values, you either want to be comparing average values with average values, marginal values with marginal values, or total values with total values. Another thing to look out for is whether we're comparing short-run or long-run values. And we see this a lot. So a short-run value is a value of natural capital, let's say over 12 months or so. There's a technical definition that differentiates between a short-run and a long-run value that we can talk about later on. But a short-run value is the value of something over a short period. So, for example, the value, how much people are willing to pay for water supply if you're an irrigator and you're during a drought during a drought year, the short-run value might actually be much higher than what you're willing to pay on average over the longer run, because you've got to get water to make sure that your trees survive. If your trees die, you've got to go back and start planting out again. So your short-run value is different from your long-run value. A long-run value is the value, how much you're willing to pay for something over the much, much longer term. And again, what you want to be looking for when you're looking at natural capital economic valuations is you want to be asking the question, are these short-run valuations that are being used, or are they long-run valuations that are being used? We see a lot of people mixing short-run and long-run values. For policy and for long-run investment, you should be using long-run values, not short-run values. But again, we do see people mixing those two things. So again, something to watch out for. Another thing that we want to watch out for is whether you're measuring the value of the natural capital asset at the same endpoint. So A classic example here is take Sydney Harbour, for example. If you ask people how much are you willing to pay to have a healthy Sydney Harbour in 40 years' time versus how much are you willing to pay for a healthy Sydney Harbour in 3 years' time or now, people's willingness to pay is going to be very different. And that's basically because as humans, we want things now. We don't want things in 30 years. In 30 years, I may well be dead. It's not going to matter to me. So people have very, very different valuations depending on what the endpoint is. And we often see people taking valuations from a study where, say, the benefits are described as benefits in 30 years' time, and comparing that to a study that has done a valuation of an asset or of a natural capital asset or service where the asset is going to be delivered in 3 years' time. Now, that's comparing apples and oranges because one natural capital asset is going to be delivered in 30 years and the other one's going to be on your doorstep tomorrow. They're fundamentally different things. And so another thing to look out for is have studies adjust for differences in endpoints. And again, this is something that we see again and again, economic consultants and advisors not doing when they're advising government and other people in this work. The other points that we make here in terms of trips and traps to look out, number one is that, and we'll speed through these just in interest of time to get to the questions, is that natural capital is often non-linear and dynamic. And what we mean by that is that people's willingness to pay for a good or service might, like a cup of coffee, increase very, very quickly to get some basic level of supply of the good, but after a while it might flatten off. Similarly, if you change the condition of a natural asset, don't just assume because you've halved the amount of natural asset that exists that people are only willing to pay half. Their willingness to pay might be different. And so again, one of the things that you want to be looking out for when you're looking at natural capital valuations is what sort of adjustments have people made, have your advisors made to account for the fact that natural capital values are often non-linear, often non-additive, and also have what we call distance decay effects. Distance decay effects just simply mean that I'm probably going to be more likely to pay for a park if it's next door to me than I am going to be willing to pay for a natural capital asset that's 200 kilometres away from me. And that's simply because with the park that's right next to my house, I'm going to have the benefit of using it more. So these sorts of distance decay effects also need to be taken into account. All right. Trips and traps to look out for too. This slide specifically deals with, and again, I know we're moving through this really, really quickly, and hopefully we'll have 30 minutes to talk through the material, and also more than happy to have follow-up conversations with anybody who wants, and also happy to share these slides afterwards with you. So this slide is about value transfer. And remember, we talked about value transfer before. Value transfer is taking natural capital values from one site and transferring them to another site. It's a technique that is used really, really widely, and it's a technique where there are lots of trips and traps that you should be looking out for. It requires expertise to do it. It's not just good enough to select a number and say, well, if it's $5 per hectare over here, then it's $5 per hectare over here. It's adjustments need to be made. And so some of the things that you can do to avoid what we call transfer errors is choose good quality studies when you're looking at studies to apply value transfer from. And so for us, a good quality study is probably something done post 2000, because natural capital valuation methods have come leaps and bounds over time in terms of their approaches and also in terms of their robustness. Look for peer research, peer-reviewed work if you can. That's always a good gold standard and a bit of a badge to have. And also look to apply studies where they have larger sample sizes. And so, a sample size is how many people you ask in a survey. So look for surveys that run, say, 500 people or more. Because with 500 people or more, we start to get up to the point where responses can be representative. You also then want to minimize your transfer errors. And so what you need to be taking, there's a whole range of things that you want to take into account. You want to have similarity between the site and the location you're transferring the asset to. or the value to. You want to have similarity in the policy change that you're taking from the site and transferring it to. And also, really importantly, you want to have similarity in terms of the demographics. So the people that you're taking the value from a site from and applying it to. You know, a classic example of that was once we saw a piece of water valuation work done by an economic consulting firm for an Australian business where they valued the economic value of water for industrial use using a study from China. And so, you know, for that to be valid, you would have to say that China and Australia have similar production profiles in terms of what we manufacture, similar willingness to pay for water, and also similar values in terms of the values that we hold for water. Simply, quite frankly, it doesn't. That sort of logic doesn't hold water. Sorry, that was a dad joke. You want to be only using studies where you have confidence when you take studies from one site and apply them to another site, that you have similarity or have at least accounted for differences in the study site, the location site, the policy change, and the policy change at the location site, and then also the people who are going to be benefiting from that change. Final point there we'd say is report value ranges and point estimates. And I think, you know, the fundamental point here is that we often see benefit costs and investment cases where people say, well, the economic value of urban heat reduction is $4.32 billion, 65 cents. That's totally spurious accuracy. What you want to be doing is you want to be seeing results where people say, we think it's in the range of 4 to 5 billion, and we think the midpoint is somewhere around here. And here are all the things that we're sure about, and here are the things that we're not sure about with the valuation. The reason that you want to do that is because it helps decision makers make better decisions. If we say it's the value is 4.72 billion, people think about the information you're presenting them in different ways. And so really what you need to be emphasizing with natural capital valuations is that these are estimates, that there is a value range, and there are also a range of things that are driving uncertainty. And one of the benefits of understanding what's driving uncertainty is once we start to think about what the key uncertainties are, people will then start to target their direction to say, how do we reduce that uncertainty so that we actually make better decisions? And we end up making better decisions. So don't rely on point values that where a consultant tells you that it's an exact number. Ask them for a range and ask them what's driving the uncertainties. We'll get to better decisions. All right, 2 more slides, and I'll move through this very quickly. Look, all we wanted to say is here's an example of natural capital valuation work that we've done previously, and it really just gives an example of the types of things that we've thought about and think about when we do value transfer. So this is an example of estimating the economic value of waterways in a state in Australia. And essentially the way that we come at that piece of work is we take geographic or GIS information on all of the waterways in the state and their condition and how that condition is changing over time. We take estimates of the total number of households that we understand are going to be impacted by the policy change. And then we also take the total length of waterways. And so I've just said that previously. The second thing that we do after we have that information is we look at how we understand households' willingness to pay for waterway condition and length changes as a function of waterway length and as a function of waterway quality. And so without going into too much detail, there's at least 30 studies in Australia that have looked at those 2 parameters. And again, with a bit of fancy math, we can come up with estimates of willingness to pay as a function of waterway length, waterway type, waterway quality. And we then use that estimate in the value transfer estimate. And the reason that we do that is because willingness to pay for waterway is quite nonlinear. So people are really willing to pay for high quality condition waterways, and they're really willing to shift really low quality waterways out of their low base condition. But in the middle condition, they're not as, the willingness to pay for changes and shifts isn't as significant. And that sort of policy understanding is really important, but it's also really important to when we're doing the valuations. After we've applied those sort of adjustments, we then apply it to the population withstanding to come up with the waterway economic value, which is both a total value, but also allows us to do marginal values. So, you know, if we improve 500 kilometres of degraded waterway, what is the type of economic benefit that we will get as a natural capital value as a result of undertaking that investment? Again, happy to come back to this, but this is an applied example of work that we've done. All right, last slide before we jump into questions and discussion. So look, things to ask your advisor, and happy to go around many times on this, but to coin Jimi Hendrix's phrase, for those of you who are old enough to have been listening to Jimmy, are you experienced is probably the question that we'd be asking. So what we've tried to emphasize through this presentation is that there are a range of trips and traps that you need to be looking out for when you're working with an economic advisor who says that they can do natural capital valuation. There are economic firms that can do natural capital valuation well, and there are also natural firms that frankly don't do it well. So we recommend that you step through a series of questions when you're looking to engage people or when you're looking at natural capital valuations that are done previously. One thing to ask is, have you actually applied this method before yourself? So if somebody is valuing an urban park by looking at house prices around it, you should ask, have you ever done a hedonic pricing study? No. Who would you rather get advice from about flying a plane? A pilot or somebody who's read books about flying planes? I prefer to get my advice from a pilot. It's the same thing with non-market valuation. If somebody hasn't applied a technique for valuing natural capital before, there should be a red flag, because potentially they don't fully understand how the method is being used or how to apply it, or the types of adjustments that you need to make sure that your estimates are robust and defensible. So first question always, have you ever done this sort of study before? Have you ever, when you're transferring values, are you transferring values from a type of study that you've done before? If they say no, make sure they partner with somebody who knows the technique so that they can pick up on any issues. The other questions that you want to be asking are, how have you made the values commensurate? And again, happy to go back to that slide and talk about the different types of things that you need to be looking at. But fundamentally, you want to make sure that they're not comparing apples and oranges. We're seeing it a lot, frankly, and it's not leading to good investment decisions. So make sure that they're asked, how are you making these values commensurate? In what way are they commensurate values? Another thing that you want to be asking them is, how have you accounted in your work for non-linearities, substitution effects, and things like distance decay? And again, they're things that we all briefly touched on. Happy to go back to them. But again, these things are all fundamental to coming up with a robust and defensible natural capital valuation. If they haven't made these types of adjustments, again, get them to partner with somebody who knows how to make those adjustments so that you have robust and defensible estimates. Another question to ask them, which is a little bit more technical, is whether they're estimating within or beyond bounds of the original study. And so what I mean by that is that if you've done a study where you've asked people to say, let's go back to the rivers, say their willingness to pay for a 100-kilometre stretch of river improvement, you can't then take that willingness to pay for 100 kilometres and apply it to 1,000 kilometres. And the fundamental reason for that is because you haven't asked that question. You've asked a question saying, how much are you willing to pay for a 100-kilometre improvement, not 1,000 kilometres? And so it's not reasonable to say, well, 100 kilometres is just, 1,000 kilometres is just 10 times of what they're willing to pay for 100, because we know they're not. There's a lot of evidence to show that. So again, we're seeing quite a bit of out of bounds estimating going on. And it's something that people should be alert to, because again, it's not a robust and defensible estimate. The other final thing that you should be asking is basically, what do I need to know? What have I asked? What haven't I asked that I should be asking? And so what that really goes to is say, tell me all the things that I need to know about this study, uncertainties, limitations, strengths, so that when I go to the board, or when I'm talking to my bosses, or when I'm advocating for something within the community, I can put my hand on my heart and say, this is a value estimate. This is the level of uncertainty with the value estimate, and here are the things that we need to be aware of when we're looking at this natural capital valuation. And what we find again and again is when you do that, when you let people underneath the hood into the black box, it brings them into the conversation and allows them to start problem solving and thinking about things in different ways, and thinking about how to manage risks and uncertainties in different ways. And we end up with better outcomes. Where to next? We always think that there's room for developing better practice standards. We've been working with a bunch of water businesses in Victoria and different state governments across Australia, developing better practice standards. Others have been as well. And we'd encourage that. The more that we can have a community of practice and a consistent understanding of how to apply these techniques well, the better off we're going to be in the long run. All right, thanks everybody for attending, and hope to catch you soon.